Hi, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Paul Werbos, who will be talking about new technology and market design to prevent climate extinction. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for a chance to speak to you critical, important people in the IEEE community. People in IEEE may not realize just how important you are and we are to the very survival of the human species. That's not an exaggeration. In the chat, I posted a link to a recent report from the Secretary General of the United Nations. And that report really was stimulated by some conversations I was involved in with some of the futurists. And we were asking, what are the real threats to the very existence of the human species? And the Secretary General actually proposed several months ago that the risks from climate change are so serious that we need a new office out of the Security Council of the United Nations to evaluate the big threat, not the little threats that everybody's worried about. But what about the big threat that climate change might become so bad that we could lose the whole species? That was the question. That's not the only major threat to the human species. I view it as one of the four big threats. The climate threat should be the easiest to understand because we now have really solid science to understand what the risk is to our species and what we can do about it. But the problem is a lot of the decision-making going on around the world is not informed by the best science. And that's why IEEE is absolutely critical. This first slide, at the bottom it says, overcome conflicts of interest. If I look at what all the nations of the world are really doing today on climate change, there are thousands of people trying to make money off of climate change. There are thousands of people who see climate change as a new market opportunity or a way to do a little something useful. But there's a real problem in the information about what the worst climate risks are and about what the best technology and market design is to overcome these problems. Let me mention, you guys probably know about the Power and Energy Society, one of the most important societies within IEEE. I've been working with them for many years. The Power and Energy Society may be the world's best network of information, not connected to a special interest, on what do we really know about electricity. And that's a big part of the climate problem, one big part. But the Power and Energy Society has also been getting very deep into the transportation issues. And so the IEEE Wiley book series editor for the Power and Engineering Society got in touch with me several months ago. And he said, we really need to bring this information together. People are getting bad information from the mass media. Special interests, conflicts of interest are screwing up climate policy in all major nations of the world. They're spending huge amounts of money without getting the benefits. And so he said, Paul, since you used to run electric power at the National Science Foundation, and since I know you've been working in these other areas, I want you to contact the same kind of people you used to bring to review panels, the same kind of people you used to fund when you were at NSF. Create a new network of information to get the best information on what we could do much better than any of the plans now found in governments around the world. When I started talking to people about this, I learned that overcoming the conflicts of interest that create barriers between the best technology and the problems, that's half of what we got to deal with. Of course, half of what we got to deal with is to understand the problem. And I guess another half is what we could do about it in a cost-effective way. So as I say, the IEEE book editor series, Kumar Venyagamurthy, asked me to start building this network and organizing a book that IEEE could publish that would provide the kind of information you will not find in any other sources. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And the title of the book proposal, New Technology and Market Design to Prevent Climate Extinction. That's the issue. The issue is, how do we stay alive? How can we as a species stay alive and deal with this threat in a cost-effective way? This effort was an incredible wake-up call for me. I learned a lot of things I didn't know. They chose me because I used to run electric power at NSF. So I do know a lot about these issues. Before that, I worked in the Department of Energy. I was responsible for the long-range energy forecasts of DOE for many years. But this book effort has taught me many things I didn't know. It's taught me many things the policymakers don't know yet, and they need to know because it's a matter of life and death. And so there are 4 major findings that have come from the book effort so far. We have a lot more work to do, but we have already learned a lot of critical things the policymakers need to know tomorrow, and the investors need to know, because investors don't always put money into what could have the greatest impact. So the 4 biggest messages I want to talk about today, each one of these messages deserves at least an hour. Each one of these messages requires proof. If you just believe what I say, that's scary, okay? And IEEE, we're supposed to be a little more skeptical and careful, all of us. You're supposed to be skeptical of me, and I hope you are. And if you want to find out whether what I'm saying makes sense or not, there is a website down there. And I hope that's easy to remember. At that website, one of my colleagues has started to build in links to the detailed technical papers which support what I'm about to say. And what I'm about to say is pretty strong, but there is proof. The 4 main things I want to say. The first thing is, we are much closer to extinction of the human species than anyone serious would have believed a year ago. I did not believe a year ago we are as close as we are. And I have 2 collaborators who were stunned when they looked at the new data. We put the new data together as part of the book effort. Because as part of the book effort, I got the #1 expert on mass extinctions of life, the #1 expert on on ocean current dynamics, and I know a few things. And we compared the databases. The combination was very scary. So the species is at stake. This is a serious matter for every one of us. The next thing is, there are ways to solve the problem, thank God. And I used to think, if you got 2 messages, one is fear, but one is hope, and you can solve the problem, hey, hope should be the easy thing to sell. Fear should be the hard thing. But it turns out, if you have ways to solve these problems, there are certain vested interests. There are certain lobbyists who work for the oil companies. I've met them as part of my jobs. There are people who work for oil companies who have a particular idea. There are also great people who work for oil companies, but there's a mixture of people in all of these institutions, and there are vested interests which simply get in the way of honest, objective discussion. They don't think that's what they're paid to do. And so the conflict of interest blocking information is the #1 reason why I worry about the survival of the human race. The solutions exist. IEEE researchers, if you put them together, we people in the IEEE together, we can solve these problems in a cost-effective, rapid way. But there are conflicts of interest which block the flow of information. And that's why every one of you could be critical in making this survivable. The 4th big message I wish I had more time for is that, of course, climate change is not the only threat to the human species. There are other things involving the new internet, involving slaughter bots, involving nuclear war. There are a few other major threats which are connected to the climate threats. And there is a draft section of the book that talks about those connections, and they are important. And yet there is positive hope. The new technology gives us hope of human potential rising to a much higher level than we see now. So there's a lot of hope as well as risk. So now I'll jump to the risk. Why do I think this is a problem? I didn't used to think this was a problem. In the year 2009, I was responsible for electric power research and AI and quantum stuff at the National Science Foundation. And when Obama said he was going to create new climate legislation, this is one of his two big priorities. The National Science Foundation said these guys are going to need help. This is difficult engineering. You know about optimization, and they better know how to optimize a little better. And so we want you to spend a year on detail on the year of climate legislation in the Environment and Public Works Committee. If this picture was a little bit better, you might even see my hair there behind one of the chairs. We had hearings in Environment and Public Works on the nature of the climate problem. And in that, at the time of this hearing, I did not believe that climate change was an existential threat. I accepted this job only because there's a national security connection. I was worried about the supply of oil. And I told the senator I worked for, I can help you on climate as long as we understand my priority is the national security, and we should work on legislation that can help national security and the climate together both. And the senator said, yes, okay. So I worked for Senator Specter that year. I was part of the core team in Environment and Public Works, and I attended all the hearings. And I still remember the hearing when one of the Republican witnesses, a climate denier, spoke up, the lead climate denier in the country, by the way, spoke up and he said, you guys shouldn't worry so much about CO2. Don't you know that the CO2 was more than 2,000 parts per million? Here we are worried about 500 or maybe 1,000. It was more than 2,000 for millions of years, most of our history in the early Earth. Didn't life just go on as usual? How bad could it really be? And at the time of that hearing, nobody in the room knew the answer to that question. I didn't, and I didn't think it was such a big problem. But I decided I shouldn't just believe that on faith. As a scientist, I should keep my eyes open. And I kept my eyes open. And later that year, the National Science Foundation invited me back. The head of the Geosciences Directorate of the NSF invited us to a big talk, and he introduced a guy named Peter Ward. He said, Peter Ward is the #1 expert of the real science of past mass extinctions of life on Earth. The #1 frontline empirical scientist studying what really happened in all those years when CO2 was often above 2,000 parts per million. And so I came to hear his talk. And in his talk, he showed a graph, a time series of the carbon dioxide in past millions of years. This only goes back 600 million years. Sometimes we go back 5 billion lately, but this goes way back before the dinosaurs anyway. And on this graph, he showed us that there were peaks of carbon dioxide. And at those peaks, a poison gas came to the air called H2S. You have smelled parts per billion of H2S. If you've smelled rotten eggs, if you've ever been to a really terrible swamp, H2S in parts per billion stinks so hard, well, you would run away. But this wasn't parts per billion. This was much more. H2S in the air reached a level where all humans on Earth would have been killed 10 times over. And there was also radiation that went with that would have been enough to kill all humans. And when Peter Ward gave his talk, he ended up saying, oh, and by the way, I've looked at the recent data. I've looked at the curves. And when I look at these curves, it's very interesting. We seem to be on an upward curve that kind of fits the periods in the past when this happened. And Peter Ward said, it's just my gut feeling. I'm not in that field, but my gut feeling is if we keep going at the same rate and get to 1,000, it'll happen all over again and we'll all die. At the end of that talk, I didn't say I believe him. In fact, more depressing than his talk was hearing the audience. Half the people in the audience said, nothing about climate is true. Nothing. It couldn't possibly be true. You wonder, why do they think that? There were a lot of creatures who died because of this stuff. This is real. But the other half of the audience scared me even more because they walked out of there saying, this slide proves that I'm a good person. It proves I support climate legislation. I support Obama. It proves I'm a good person and I'll go back to my gardening. And that really scared me because that's not the solution. When I walked out of that room, I said, first, I want to know, is it real? Second, I want to know if it might be real, what's going to drive it? And third, what the hell can we do about it if it turns out to be real? And so I started on a long campaign to learn more about this stuff. One thing I learned about, I read Peter Ward's book, Under a Green Sky. It only cost me about $7 from Amazon. And it described in great detail how this big extinction event really happened. And the first part of his story was about something about the ocean developing low oxygen levels, stratified ocean, he called it. Stratified, layered ocean, where in the deep layers of the ocean, you get low oxygen. And what the low oxygen does is it allows the proliferation of a certain kind of microbe, a sulfonogenic archaea. And that kind of microbe is what produced the H2S, which bumped up to the top and killed everybody. And we have data now from NOAA, this is from a NOAA report, on meters per year drop, how many meters we got. And if you look at how many meters it's dropping per year on the Pacific side of the ocean, it's shallow enough and the decline is fast enough. You look at it, it kind of looks like we have 40 years left before this happens. When I saw this, that was just the beginning of a journey, but I was beginning to wonder. This year, I had the good luck, thanks to IEEE, I was able to get the attention of people like Peter Ward himself and Wadhams, a big ocean current expert. And we had discussions, including discussions on Canadian television, to figure out what do we know? How real is this threat? We looked at the current data on the oxygen levels, better data. And it turns out it's not just oxygen. There's another critical factor. And we now know the other critical factor is fertilizer. It stands to reason. This is a bug that doesn't like oxygen, but it likes to be fed. And if there's a major part of the ocean that has low oxygen and the fertilizer is there to feed the bug, and if it's at the root of the currents that bring oxygen to the surface, if you got those things combined, well, that's what caused the big extinctions. And it turns out that is where we are now, unfortunately. We have had detailed discussions, again, in the orbit of the book, where we got really deep into what the oxygen levels are, what the data sources are. If you go to the website I'll show you, or I showed you, there's a draft preface. That preface was written by Ward, Werbos, and Wadhams. We cite the data. You don't have to believe me. Good IEEE citations, URLs, right in that brief preface. Quickly, in a page or two, it gives the critical sources, the critical data. And if you understand that data, you'll understand why I'm worried and why I hope other people will pick up on this. Not just old men like me, We need new people to get in here and fix these problems. But how do we fix these problems? Basically, there are new technologies for market design and technology. Now, some people look at this word market design and they say, oh my God, this is terrible. They don't like market design. They say, that's not IEEE business, that's economics. I've gotten feedback from military space people who say markets don't work anymore. They agree with Putin. They think the age of democracy and markets, they don't work anymore. We need a new system, which is the same thing Putin is saying. And what I say to them is, no, you're talking about badly designed markets. You need to know that market design is a major part of what the IEEE Power and Energy Society does. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. But market design is a key IEEE technology, and IEEE has figured out how to solve problems which a lot of the rest of the world doesn't begin to understand. So, key point, policymakers and investors need better sorts of information. We are not perfect, but they need real information. I do know a lot of what's going on in climate policy worldwide. Remember, that was my job in the US Senate for a year, and we contacted the whole world, so we know what's going on. This year, I was very excited when I saw a wonderfully beautiful, intelligent woman in the European Union in charge of global security for the European Union. Her name is von der Leyen. I see her every day on France 24 on television. She's a wonderful person, and she represents a political coalition which cares about climate change as a high priority. And all of the enthusiasts of Europe have gone to von der Leyen saying, you don't need to import natural gas from Russia. You don't need to burn fossil fuels. We have new ways you can power the electricity in Europe, and we can move them fast. We have a solution to climate change. Implement our solution. And I've seen 100 of these solutions. I know what these people are proposing. If you believe what they say, they'll tell you they can build a solar farm tomorrow that has low cost, and we can do it tomorrow. And they say they know how to do it, but they don't know how to do it. Von der Leyen was listening to them. She set up a major group to try to make it happen. She wants to get rid of that Russian oil import right now. Has something to do with the Ukraine. She really wants to cut back on that import of fossil fuel. The Green Coalition of Germany is rightly telling her, let's get off of fossil fuel. Let's move quickly. She wants to do it. And she got all her people to study, what can we do? And the best they could come up with is a plan that takes forever, hardly solves the problem, leaves us on a path to death, not only by Ukraine, but by climate. So what's wrong? What's wrong is she's not getting the kind of information we have. Because we have had access to the IEEE and NSF review systems, which are infinitely better than these stakeholder politics in bringing information up, bubbling up, and finding out where the real technology opportunities are. This project has shown me where they are. I'm not speaking hypothetically. If you go to the webpage, you'll see papers from the world's leaders in the real technology, not the lobbyists you'll meet in Brussels or Washington. The people who are building the real technology, I'm so grateful they agreed to help in this project, and they've all made critical contributions, and you put it together, we have exciting options out there. But what are the options? Back when I was working with EPW, there used to be reports every year from the Energy Information Administration on CO2 emissions from the United States. This particular report got discontinued because some people didn't care about climate. I don't know all that politics, but I do know the data is still basically the same. What we found out if you look at where the CO2 comes from directly, more than 80% of the CO2 from the United States, where it comes from directly, is from just two activities: making electricity and transportation. Those happen to be areas where IEEE PES has deep technical information. And again, I'm grateful for the people who have it for helping me put this together. Even in the industrial sector, it turns out a lot of the electricity, a lot of the carbon dioxide in the industrial sector comes from industry making electricity and industry running things like off-highway vehicles. So the bottom line is, instead of wasting time making the regulations perfect for small company glass makers or office buildings or server farms, those are all penny ante. That's misdirection. That's confusion. That's a waste of energy and time. What we really need to do is make the electricity itself and do the transportation with zero net CO2. And if we do that, we don't need to waste a lot of time and energy on the little things. The big things, making electricity and transportation, that's where the big, cheap opportunities lie. This is where we can make a massive change if we learn to work together using the new technologies. So what this boils down to, if we had more time, what I wanted to do with this IEEE book is to present a 5-point plan to prevent climate extinction. This is the 5-point plan I proposed even on my personal website. These are the 5 things we really need to focus on. And as engineers, you know, you don't get anything done if you don't have a target and a focus. If you let yourself get distracted by all kinds of nonsense, you won't get the job done. We need to have 5 focuses. We need 5 efforts working together. I even proposed to these United Nations people, if you set up a climate office, you need 5 sectors in that office, or 5 divisions. And you need to have heavy focus, expert focus, NSF, IEEE level quality review and feedback in all 5 of these. And number 1 is reducing the CO2 that comes out of making electricity. And you need to work with the people who know how to make electricity. That's us. That's not those lobbyists. And of course, the beauty of the IEEE and NSF system is they are not top-down systems. They are not systems where you got some really rich guy who comes up with all the answers in his bathtub. The beauty of the IEEE system and the NSF system is they're wide open. They're designed to take inputs from creative ideas from people all over and evaluate them intelligently. That's critical. That's what I hope the UN learns how to copy. So number 1 is electricity, making electricity. The biggest section of our draft book is how to cut down the CO2 making electricity. The next one is how to cut down net CO2 out of transportation. The other 3 are important. I was hoping in the book that we could get a good section on agriculture, like regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of critical stuff there. This is just as big as the other 2 sectors, but it was hard to get a good report for IEEE because there's a lot of conflict there. So we've got a section going to draft what I know about this sector, but the real meat is this 2, and these 2 together, it's more than 80% of what comes from the US. We also need more research on what these risks are of survival. And I think we need some emergency stuff on geoengineering. So now, electricity. This is the number 1 area where we have the world leaders contributing to this book. If you go to the website, you'll see what these world leaders have to say. We even have an early conversation with faces that everybody ought to know. The first thing people need to know about electricity, the United States has been a major pioneer in greater efficiency in the electricity sector. There are a lot of people who claim to be experts in electric power who don't know what they need to know. You'll see I mentioned FERC.com. When I ran the electric power research at the National Science Foundation, People from universities all over the country would ask me, how do we learn what the system is? How do we learn the reality? Because they hear different stories from different people. You hear experts in the US government who say one thing, professors say another thing. How do you find the truth? I said, go to the webpage of FERC, the event calendar. They had workshops led by a guy named Dick O'Neill, who is part of our book. And you'll see his name and his face if you click on our website. He was the person who organized and integrated this knowledge of the new US system. And the new US system is a great breakthrough. The quick story is, we have already had a huge breakthrough in the electric power sector, mainly because of research by IEEE PES people. So we have already had one breakthrough, but we need to take it a step further for another breakthrough to deal with the new problems we have. So we as a community are facing two main challenges here. We have to explain to the rest of the world what we have already done in market design. The large-scale power system of the United States is a wonder of the world. It is the greatest machine ever made by man. Before the research created this new system, there was a kind of war between people who wanted a socialist system, which wasn't really working, and people who wanted Wild West, which led to all kinds of scandals and corruption. And then there was research funded by the National Science Foundation and the Electric Power Research Institute. DOE got on board a lot later, but in the beginning, it was just the Electric Power Research Institute and NSF. Together with a small amount of money, we funded cross-disciplinary research, which developed new market designs. And these market designs are computer controlled. These are not your old style corrupt markets. These are mathematically well-defined optimization systems that give you an optimal balance between consumers and producers. It is a wonder of the world what has been achieved already. In other sectors of the economy, people need to learn about this. They need to learn you can build markets which are not corrupt, which are transparent. You can build markets which balance the interests of the different players, so they don't have to go bribing each other to get what they want. You can participate in a rational market which works. So it was a great achievement, but there's something that didn't achieve. Because of the limits of the algorithms and computers we had back then, it had real problems with issues like time and foresight. And so NSF put me in charge of the research program to try to do better. These are great algorithms. My friend Dick O'Neill did a great job in getting the very best algorithms and software. NSF said, we can do better, and we could. So back around 2011, NSF sent me to the White House interagency group on the smart grid policy. Now that we want an intelligent power grid, how do we do it? And I said, there are like 20 research projects. And if any of you on this call are interested in a specific research project to help, I wrote a paper where I put together like 20 projects we could fund. I knew from NSF that there were like 20 areas of specific work which fit together, which could help, which were critical. And I was hoping the White House would publish the names of all of these great researchers, but they didn't. Instead, they said, you already wrote their names in your paper. So all we have to do is cite your paper. We'll put one paragraph into the National Grid Plan, and that paragraph will cite your paper. And people who are interested in what they can do with the intelligent power grid should go to your paper. And I was uncomfortable with that at first, but then later I realized this was great, because when I ran review panels, I could send them all to this paper. And I could tell people what we want. It was a source on what are the new areas in the intelligent power grid. And that paper was published in the IEEE Computational Intelligence magazine. You probably all have access to it directly from IEEE Explore, but if you don't, I was allowed to publish it on my own personal web page. It gives you a summary of what you can do with the intelligent power grid. But now let me come back to the big issue. What van der Leyen needs to know. How can we move quickly and cheaply to an all renewable electricity generation system? Minimum cost as fast as possible. We have the new technologies. They don't know about them. There are 3 new things you need to know. There are 3 things that the book explains in great detail. We have new technologies to generate the electricity at a much lower cost. You've heard that a lot from solar advocates. I promise you, we have new technologies way beyond what they know about. And we really need the best, lowest cost existing real technology. That's part of the book. You can learn about it more on the website. I'll talk about it a little bit if I don't run out of time. But the other thing we need is storage. And this is the area where the policy people most often screw up, is they don't understand how important storage is. Any real electric power person knows it's not just the cost of generation, because if you generate electricity at the wrong time of day and you don't store it and it's intermittent, the real cost is much higher. And there are a lot of people who say the generating cost of my solar energy is so low, it's like 3-4 cents a kilowatt hour. It may be, but then you got to pay for the backup, and you got to pay for the storage, and you got to pay for the power conditioning. And it turns out that's really critical. And that's a big part of the new technology, because there is new technology for storage that needs to be part of this story. And finally, we need an intelligent power grid to make full use of the storage. And in order to make full use of storage, to use storage, what that's about, it's about when do you put power in and when do you take it out? You might say, oh, that's a simple timing decision. God help us, it's not a simple timing decision. If you have 1,000 nodes in your network operating on different schedules, and you don't know what the load is going to be, you have to decide when to put it in and when to take it out. I promise you, the optimization problem you face when you're doing stuff over time to make use of storage and to account for uncertainty, this is a fundamental technology in itself. We have this new technology, but not everybody does. There are people in IEEE who know how to do optimization in the face of uncertainty. There's a new set of technology we call reinforcement learning, approximate dynamic programming. It's been applied to electric power. It works. We had NSF projects that proved that it works. There are people who are making it work, but the people in Europe probably don't know it exists. And we have new extensions of it. So these are the key elements. That shouldn't have been a bullet, though. Okay, this is one item. So there are 3 things we need, and we can combine all 3. That's what we need to do. They're all real. So let me talk a little bit more about this time of day issue. The storage issue, a lot of it is time of day. What I'm showing you on this slide, some people call it the 2-horned devil. I saw this slide for the first time at a meeting held by a guy named Seifer Rahman. I hope some of you know who he is. Seifer Rahman has been president of the IEEE Power and Engineering Society. He was once a colleague of mine at the National Science Foundation. We worked together. And now he is president-elect of all of IEEE. The president-elect of all of IEEE was the guy who set up the workshop, which showed me this graph. And this graph was all about California. In California, they wanted to use more renewables in the real world. And they were pushing renewables very, very hard, wind and solar. And so they had a certain demand curve, and they had a certain amount of solar generation. And guess what? The solar generation tended to be in the daytime. Surprise. Some people are surprised by the fact that solar power tends to be generated in the daytime. And in California, when they looked at this solar energy, they pushed it as hard as they could. And all of a sudden, the net demand the actual load minus the solar input became the two-horned devil. It's a load curve where all of a sudden, yeah, you can meet the total demand, but the demand at these times of day became the big problem. And the big problem was storage. If you could store this problem in the daytime for free, oh, you'd be home free. You only need to pay attention to generation costs. But most of the world, they're paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a killer just for the storage. So storage is really, really critical. Managing storage is also critical. So you need low-cost storage and low-cost generation and control to use them. Now, in terms of the solar technology, this is an area where I have learned a lot in the last few years. When I ran the electric power research at NSF, I thought I knew a lot. I had a lot of good information sources, the best in the world. I was invited to join something called the National Energy Research Consortium of Chile. And Chile is a magnificent source of information on solar power because they have one of the best deserts in the world. They have a great market. And at least that year, they had a political system that could really handle the economics and the politics in a rational way. And when I went to Chile, I visited several times. When I first visited, I was excited by the low cost of solar cells. I was really excited when I found out there was a company which bid in Chile. They had a competitive market system for new electric generation. They weren't just sitting there giving money to their friends. They had a competitive market system, and they had a special line where people with solar farms based on solar cells could compete on price and quality, meeting rules. And the lowest cost was 3 cents a kilowatt hour. I was really excited. They signed a contract, a real company, 3 cents a kilowatt hour for a power purchase agreement. And for Latin America, I knew that was a time of day problem. But the beauty of Latin America is they have connections to Brazil and hydropower, which solves the storage problem in a way that nobody else on the earth can. So Latin America has a special advantage. I was really excited by it. However, I had to learn from these people. And there are a lot of things I learned from these people. First, I learned that this cheap PPA was based on a company that got a price deal based on subsidies in China. And China has decided they don't want to subsidize the rest of the world so much. So you got to deal with higher costs, higher cost per kilowatt hour. Also, you had to import the stuff from China. You can't use local labor, and that was a problem for Chile. But the other thing is the time of day problems are huge, and we couldn't solve the time of day problem the way they can in Chile. We don't have a Brazil there to trade with. So now it turns out the biggest power purchase agreements in the real world, in the real desert, powering Chile, were big power purchase agreements using the power tower version of solar power. If I were a personal friend of von der Leyen, that would be so great. The number one thing I would urge her to do first is beat up those guys at Siemens and Fraunhofer and get them to offer something else besides these wind turbines. Get them to implement construction of large-scale power tower solar power in Greece. And instead of building wires at the bottom of the North Sea, build wires in the Aegean Sea. That's a little easier to do. Bring the solar electricity from power towers to the islands of Greece, which are great sites for solar power. Use the new power tower technology, which has new storage, and that's the critical thing. Chile has developed new thermal storage systems much cheaper than what we are hoping for from batteries in the future. So this is critical. If the only thing you had was solar cells, you have to store electricity. It turns out concentrated heat, you can store it, it's proven, at much lower cost with high controllability. They have the technology working in Chile. Those people are contributing to the book. They could do it tomorrow. You could do this tomorrow in Greece to save the energy from new power tower solar farms in Greece. So that's one of the key technologies. But there are other key technologies. In the United States, we have what's called Brayton technology, 2 generations of it, which can convert the heat to electricity much more efficiently than anything you've ever read. There's proven technology from General Electric and Heliogen running 50% conversion efficiency, but there's also a new generation that looks like 70 or 80, and that's a low-risk research project. We know how to do it because there's technology we learned from Sterling that can be transferred. So bottom line is we can reduce the cost of making electricity with 0 carbon dioxide highly efficiently, and it's ready to go now. We don't have to wait for 10 years. So I did mention control is also a critical technology. I probably pretty much ran out of time. The reason I ran this program at the National Science Foundation was I had developed a proposal for how to do the intelligent power grid using real intelligent systems. My biggest prize in IEEE will be this coming year. Well, this year, actually. In July, they're awarding me what's called the Frank Rosenblatt Award for computational intelligence, because I developed a lot of the algorithms you need to build real intelligent systems. This RLADP technology, to be honest, I'm the one who started that. And I funded it for many years and gave credit to other people, but I actually started this RLADP technology, and that's very well documented. That's why they're giving me this prize. So using this optimization technology, intelligent optimization, is critical to being able to use the storage and get more benefit from it. And it's really ironic because van der Leyen has talked about intelligent grid technology. And there are many levels at which you can use this new technology. I mentioned there are 20 research opportunities for new university people. You can use this new optimization technology at the ISO level, the distribution level, the user level, and we even have a new extension. If I were still at NSF, I would be funding all 4 of these. When I handled power engineering at NSF, I funded the first 3. The 4th one is a new option. At the ISO level, we could cut the cost of renewables in half simply by having foresight and by speed, how you implement neural net chips, something like the power electronics. Optimal control of power electronics massively changes you. With a lot of wind power, you got problems with something called reactive power. It turns out with good control of power electronics, you can take power electronics and change it from being a liability to being an asset. Just by better control, you can use power electronics to reduce reactive power instead of having to pay to control the reactive power later. So intelligent control is really critical to the power grid. It's critical to the economics of wind power. And there are a lot of opportunities and technology that just is waiting to be applied. Since I'm pretty much close to out of time, let me just jump for 5 minutes over things that deserve a lot more, like oil independence. That was the biggest part of my life in 2009. There's a website where we talk about what we can do to reduce the oil dependence. We need a combination of things, a market-based approach. Anybody who says the government should tell everybody what to do, they don't know about real life. Real life, you need to give people the best choices you can and let the market decide. Because if the politicians decide, they're going to come up with the stupidest, most expensive option. But advanced technology and markets fit together, and the role of the research is to give them better options. Some of these you're already aware of. Oh my God, I hope that we can move this. Fuel flexibility is still a part of the story. We could have had fuel flexibility 10 years ago if it weren't for the politics. There's a bill called the Energy Independence and Security Act, which George Bush pushed through. If Bush's bill had done what he intended, we would be much more independent now than we are. People wouldn't worry about Russian oil because the cost of the biofuels would be lower than the cost of the oil. And the only reason we haven't experienced that was that certain Washington lobbyists in the dead of the night wrote the regulations. And I was really excited when I heard that Biden is going to relax those regulations. Senator Specter proposed a bill to make the regulations more rational, to get rid of the impediments which the lobbyists wrote into the regulations. But Senator Reid wouldn't let his bill get to the floor. The biggest problem with the plug-in electronics is, well, this is an IEEE technology. Let's just put it that way. There's a lot of new technology which PES researchers are well equipped to advance, which can reduce the cost of these plug-in hybrids or electric cars. One of the people I was glad to fund a little bit was this guy, Lonnie Johnson. Right now, the Chinese are on course to totally beating us with electric cars because frankly, they have better batteries. But Elon Musk has worked with the Chinese and he's got some pretty good batteries too, batteries which the other companies don't have because of the contacts he has with the Chinese. But there is an Afro-American guy in Atlanta who is very credible, who we reviewed, who has a battery which is better yet. He has a rechargeable lithium-air battery. All the numbers look good. It amazes me that we haven't succeeded in deploying that battery. He had a collaborative program with Royce on how you could build an electric airplane. This is a description of what they came up with. They could do it, and we really should be doing it. This is something the US should be doing. So since I have a total of what, 5 minutes left, maybe as many as 10, I've talked about transportation, greenhouse gases in transportation. I talked about the risk, and I talked about making electricity without CO2. Those are the biggest parts of the book. And if you go to the webpage, it'll talk about them a lot. But as a matter of honesty, I drafted a section 5 for the book talking about what we missed. Because after all, it's not only electric power. So there's agriculture, there's nuclear, there's internet, and there's human potential. And our draft of that section does get into these aspects. And if the book ever exists, I hope we'll be able to do more justice because these are also important. And that's probably as much as I should say. Thank you for your patience.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for your talk. Your image of a hillbilly fuel maker will stay with me for years. It's a great picture.
Yeah.
A lot of the technologies you talked about are disruptive, where you can't really predict how big an impact they would have. Which of the technologies that you've talked about do you think are the most disruptive?
So what's disruptive depends on your metric. For example, the one I recommended the most are these big solar farms in Greece or maybe Spain, right? That's the first one I would jump with if I had to pick one next week. And who would that disrupt? Gazprom would be mad as all hell. You don't need to import all that gas from the Soviet Union. Or, well, no, sorry, from the empire. It's not the Soviet Union anymore. It's the White Army that Mr. Putin is leading. And he would be very upset, I think. Of course, if he overcame his upset, he would realize, hey, Russia can play in this game. They don't have to sit back and die. They don't have to be dependent on fossil fuels forever. There's a lot of ways that Russia can make money without relying on the fossil fuel. But right now, the Gazprom guys would be mad as all hell, and so would Putin be. And yeah, von der Leyen might be a little happier. So it depends on who gets disrupted.
Well, for me, what disruptive technology means is one where you can't predict the outcome. For instance, people claim that gallium nitride high power microwave technology is disruptive, but it's really just an extension of previous gallium arsenide. On the other hand, silicon chips and computers have always been disruptive because you don't really know what would come out of it. If you told me about the Internet of Things 20 years ago, I would have said, what? So anyway, let's see, we're sort of running out of time. You want to make one final closing comment?
Well, when I did that paper for the NSF people, I said, there are 20 slots that need help. I sure as hell hope that some of you guys pick up at least one of these slots and run with them and work together with the people doing the other slots.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for an interesting talk, Paul. I'm going to end the recording here. So thank you.
Thank you.